The ship descended through the golden clouds of Celestin Prime, carrying cargo that the Empire considered barely worth noticing. A human male, bound in chains of light, offered as tribute from the conquered. Earth Colony's Princess Valeth Sorn-Kai stood on the landing platform with her arms crossed and her violet eyes filled with boredom as the vessel touched down and the ramp lowered with a mechanical hiss. She was tall, nearly 8 feet, with skin that glowed a soft blue in the afternoon light and silver hair that floated around her shoulders. Like smoke and water behind her stood a dozen courtiers, all whispering and laughing about the spectacle they were about to witness. The humans send us one of their males as a peace offering, a brother Prince Kethril said with amusement dripping from every word. How generous of them to give us their weakest. The court erupted in laughter, but Valeth remained silent as she watched the human emerge from the ship. He was short by Celestin standards, barely 6 feet tall, with dark hair and brown eyes that seemed unremarkable in every way. His name, according to the documents, was Marcus Kola, former soldier, a former engineer, a former many things that the Celestin did not care to remember. The guard shoved him forward, and he stumbled but did not fall, catching himself with a grace that Valeth almost missed because she was not paying close attention. Kneel before the princess, one of the guards commanded in a booming voice. Marcus looked at the guard, then at Valeth, and then he knelt slowly and deliberately, never breaking eye contact with her until his knee touched the ground. He said nothing. "Does it not speak?" Kethril asked with a sneer, walking around the human like a predator circling wounded prey. Perhaps the journey damaged its primitive brain. More laughter filled the air, but Marcus remained silent and still, his face showing no emotion, no fear, no anger, nothing at all. Valeth felt something stir in her chest, something she could not name, as she studied this strange creature who refused to react to the mockery surrounding him. "Rise," she commanded, and her voice carried across the platform like a bell. Marcus rose to his feet and stood before her with his hands still bound and his eyes still watching. "You are to be my husband," Valeth said, the words tasting strange on her tongue. "This marriage is a political formality. Nothing more. You will have quarters in my wing of the palace. You will be fed and clothed, and you will stay out of my way. Do you understand?" Marcus nodded once, a small movement that could have meant anything. "Good." Valeth turned away and began walking toward the palace. "Bring him along and try not to break him before the ceremony. Father would be annoyed if we had to request another one." The wedding took place 3 days later in a small chamber far from the grand halls where real marriages were celebrated. The emperor himself did not attend, sending only a minor official to witness the union and sign the necessary documents. Valeth wore a simple gown instead of the elaborate ceremonial robes she had dreamed of wearing since childhood, and Marcus wore the plain gray clothes of a servant because no one had thought to provide him with anything better. The vows were spoken in the Celestin tongue, words that Marcus clearly did not understand but repeated anyway with careful precision when it was done. Valeth looked at her new husband and felt nothing but a vague sense of embarrassment at how far she had fallen in the eyes of the court. "You may return to your quarters," she told him coldly. "I have duties to attend to." Marcus bowed his head slightly and left without a word, escorted by guards who snickered at his retreating back. In the weeks that followed, Valeth did her best to forget that Marcus existed. She attended council meetings and diplomatic functions and training sessions with the palace warriors, all while her silent husband became a ghost in her chambers. He was always there when she returned, sitting in a corner reading Celestin texts he could barely understand, or standing by the window watching the city below, or arranging her belongings with a quiet efficiency that she found oddly unsettling. "You do not need to do that," she told him one evening when she found him organizing her collection of ancient scrolls. "The servants will handle such tasks." Marcus looked at her with those unreadable brown eyes and said, I prefer to be useful. They were the first words he had spoken to her since their wedding. And Valeth was so surprised that she forgot to respond before he had already returned to his work. She mentioned the incident to her brother the next day, expecting him to share her confusion. But Kethril only laughed. "It is trying to make itself valuable so you will not discard it," he said dismissively. "Humans are like that, desperate, clingy creatures who cannot survive without attaching themselves to stronger beings. Ignore it, and eventually it will learn its place." Valeth tried to follow this advice, but she found herself watching Marcus more closely in the days that came. She noticed how he memorized the names of every servant who entered her chambers, greeting them with small nods that seemed to mean something in human culture. She noticed how he studied the palace guards, watching their patrol routes and shift changes with an intensity that seemed excessive for someone who was supposedly broken and harmless. She noticed how he always listened to every conversation that happened within earshot, his expression never changing, even when courtiers spoke of humans as if they were animals incapable of understanding. One night, Valeth woke from a nightmare to find Marcus sitting in the chair beside her door, wide awake and alert in the darkness. "Why are you not sleeping?" she demanded, her heart still racing from the dream. "Someone should keep watch," Marcus replied simply. "There are guards for that purpose." "Yes," Marcus agreed, and something in his voice made Valeth pause. "There are." She wanted to press him further, to demand an explanation for his strange behavior, but exhaustion pulled her back towards sleep before she could form the words as her eyes closed. She thought she saw Marcus smile a small, knowing expression that vanished so quickly. She convinced herself she had imagined I was just a human. After all, what could he possibly know that she did not? 3 years passed like water flowing through stone, slow and quiet, and seemingly without effect. But water shapes stone in ways that are not visible until the damage is already done. Marcus Cole had become part of the palace in the same way that shadows become part of a room, present but unnoticed, expected but never truly seen. He moved through the corridors with his head slightly bowed and his footsteps soft, and the Celestin nobles who passed him rarely bothered to acknowledge his existence. This was exactly what he wanted in 3 years. Marcus had learned to speak the Celestine language fluently, though he rarely demonstrated this skill in front of anyone who might report it to the wrong ears. He had memorized the layout of every floor in the palace, including the ancient servant passages that most nobles had forgotten existed. He knew the names of 347 servants, their families, their troubles, their secret hopes and quiet fears. He knew which guards could be bribed, which ones were loyal to the Emperor, and which ones had already sold their loyalty to Prince Kethril. Knew everything. And he said nothing, because humans had learned long ago that knowledge shared too freely becomes knowledge. Wasted Valeth had grown accustomed to his presence in a way that surprised her when she stopped to think about it. She no longer flinched when she found him waiting in her chambers, no longer felt the urge to send him away when important visitors arrived. He had become comfortable, like a piece of furniture that had always been there. And she sometimes forgot that he was not Celestin at all. This comfortable ignorance shattered on the night of the autumn festival. When assassins breached the palace walls, Valeth was attending a celebration. In the grand ballroom, when the lights flickered and a distant explosion shook the floor beneath her feet, screams erupted around her as nobles scrambled for the exits and guards drew their weapons with practiced efficiency. "Princess, you must come with us," the captain of her personal guard shouted over the chaos. "We will escort you to the safe room." But when they reached the corridor that led to the reinforced chamber, they found it filled with smoke and the bodies of fallen guards. "They've blocked our path," the captain growled, his hand tightening on his blade. "We must find another route." Before he could give another order, Marcus appeared from a side passage that Valeth had never noticed before. "This way," he said quietly. "I know a path they will not have covered." The captain looked at him with suspicion burning in his golden eyes. "Why should we trust a human?" "Because the alternative is standing here until the assassins find us," Marcus replied without emotion. "Choose quickly." Valeth made the decision before her guard could argue further. "Lead the way." Marcus moved through the palace like he had been born within its walls, guiding them through forgotten corridors and hidden staircases that twisted down into the foundations of the ancient building. They emerged in a sealed chamber deep beneath the throne room, a place so old that dust covered every surface and the air tasted of centuries. "How did you know about this place?" Valeth demanded as her guards secured the entrances. Marcus looked at her with those calm brown eyes that revealed nothing. "I explored. There was little else to do. The assassins were captured before dawn, and the investigation revealed that they had been hired by a rival noble house seeking to destabilize the Sonkai dynasty. No one thought to ask how the human had known exactly where to go. And Marcus offered no explanation, but Valeth remembered. She remembered again, too. Months later, when a servant brought her evening meal and Marcus quietly switched her plate with his own while she was distracted by a report from her generals, she watched in confusion as he ate the food that had been meant for her, his expression unchanging, even as his skin grew pale and his hands began to tremble. "What have you done?" she demanded, rising from her chair with alarm flooding through her. "The meat was poisoned," Marcus said calmly, though sweat was now beading on his forehead. "A compound called selenith root fatal to Celestin. Merely unpleasant for humans. I will be fine in a few hours." Valeth stared at him in disbelief as he continued eating, methodically finishing every bite to ensure that no evidence remained. "You knew it was poisoned and you ate it anyway?" "You needed to finish your report," Marcus replied. "And someone needed to identify the poison for the investigators." Two problems solved with one action. He spent the next 6 hours violently ill in the bathing chamber. But by morning he was standing at his usual post, as if nothing had happened. The servant who had delivered the meal was found to be working for Prince Kethrol, though nothing could be proven directly, and the matter was quietly buried. Valeth began watching Marcus with new eyes after that night. She noticed how her handmaiden, Sereth, would sometimes whisper into her brother's ear during court functions, and how Marcus had noticed this long before she had. She noticed how certain guards who had once been assigned to her protection were slowly replaced by others, and how Marcus seemed to approve of each change with the smallest nod of his head. She noticed how information that should have been secret somehow reached the right ears at exactly the right moment, preventing disasters that no one else had seen coming. "You are strange for a human," she told him one evening as they sat in her chambers, the city lights glowing beyond the windows. Marcus looked up from the Celestin poetry he had been reading. She had not known he could read their language until that moment, and raised an eyebrow. "I am exactly what humans are." "Your Highness," he said quietly. "You simply never asked." Valeth laughed, but the sound felt hollow even to her own ears. "And what are humans, exactly?" Marcus considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Patient," he said finally. "We are very patient. We had to be to survive our own history. Your people conquered the stars in 10,000 years. But humans spent 200,000 years just learning not to destroy ourselves. We became good at waiting, at watching, at planning for dangers that might never come." "That sounds exhausting," Valeth admitted. "It is," Marcus agreed. "But it keeps us alive." That night, for the first time since their wedding, Valeth did not order Marcus to sleep in the outer chamber. She told herself it was because she felt safer with him nearby. Which was true, but there was another truth she was not ready to admit, that somewhere in the past 3 years, She had stopped seeing him as a burden and started seeing him as something else entirely. Something she could not yet name, but something that mattered. The Emperor fell ill on the first day of winter, collapsing during a council meeting with blood streaming from his nose and his bioluminescent skin flickering like a dying star. Royal physicians rushed into his chambers and worked through the night. But by morning, their faces told the story that their words could not. The Emperor has been poisoned. The chief physician announced to the assembled court, "We do not know the compound, and we cannot find a cure. He has perhaps 3 days remaining." The throne room erupted into chaos as nobles shouted accusations and generals demanded investigations. But one voice rose above all others with cold authority. "This is the work of human sympathizers," Prince Kethrol declared, his golden armor gleaming as he strode to the center of the room. "My sister has brought a human into the heart of our palace. And now our father lies dying. Can this be coincidence?" Valith felt the blood drain from her face as hundreds of eyes turned toward her with suspicion and fear. "That is absurd," she protested. "Marcus has been with me constantly. He could not have accessed the Emperor's food or drink." "Could he not?" Kethrol smiled, a predator's expression that held no warmth. "The human moves through this palace like a ghost, appearing and disappearing at will. Who knows what secrets he has learned, what poisons he has brewed, what masters he truly serves." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Valith saw her allies begin to step back, distancing themselves from the contamination of her presence. "I call for an emergency session of the High Council," Kethrol continued, "to determine the succession and to address the threat that my sister's marriage has brought upon us all." The council convened that evening in the ancient chamber beneath the throne room. And Valith knew before the first vote was cast that she had already lost. Kethrol had spent years building his network of supporters, bribing and threatening and promising until half the council owed him their positions when the final count was announced. Valith stood alone against 17 voices declaring her unfit to rule. "The Princess Valith Sornkai is hereby stripped of her claim to the throne," the council speaker announced, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "She will be confined to her quarters until a tribunal can determine her guilt in the Emperor's poisoning. The human will be executed at dawn as a warning to all who would threaten the Dominion." Guards surrounded Valith before she could protest, their faces hard and their weapons ready. She searched the crowd for friendly eyes and found none. Even those who had once called themselves her allies now looked away, unwilling to risk their own positions for a fallen princess. They marched her through the palace corridors while servants pressed against the walls and whispered behind their hands. Her chambers had been transformed into a prison, with guards posted at every entrance, and her windows sealed with energy barriers that crackled and hummed. Marcus was already there when she arrived, sitting in his usual chair with his hands folded in his lap and his expression as unreadable as ever. "Leave us," Valith commanded the guards, and after a moment of hesitation, they withdrew to the outer room. She turned to Marcus with desperation clawing at her throat. "They are going to execute you. They are going to execute us both. My brother has finally made his move, and I was too blind to see it coming." "You were not blind," Marcus said calmly. "You were trusting. There is a difference," Valith laughed bitterly. "What does it matter now? We will both be dead by morning, and Kethrol will sit on the throne that should have been mine." "Will he?" Marcus asked, and something in his voice made Valith pause. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw that his brown eyes were not calm at all. They were sharp, focused, alive with an intelligence that she had somehow managed to overlook for 3 long years. "What do you mean?" she demanded. Marcus stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the city lights through the shimmer of the energy barrier. "Your brother made 3 mistakes," he said quietly. "The first was underestimating humans. He assumed I was a broken pet, incapable of thought or action. And he never once considered that I might be watching him as closely as he was watching you. Valeth felt her hearts begin to race. You knew about his plans? I suspected them from the first month, Marcus admitted. Your brother is not subtle. He thinks he is clever, but he leaves traces everywhere. If one knows where to look, why did you not tell me? Because you were not ready to hear it, Marcus turned to face her. And because I needed time to prepare. He reached into his sleeve and withdrew a small vial filled with golden liquid that seemed to glow with its own inner light. His second mistake was using a poison that takes 3 days to kill, Marcus continued. That gave me time to synthesize an antidote. I identified the compound months ago when I noticed unusual shipments arriving at your brother's private laboratory. Valeth stared at the vial in disbelief. You have been preparing for this. Humans plan for the worst, Marcus replied simply. It is how we survived our own history. We assume that everything that can go wrong will go wrong, and we prepare accordingly. And the third mistake? Valeth whispered. Marcus smiled, and for the first time she saw the soldier that the Earth colonies had sent her, not a broken tribute, but a weapon disguised as a gift. He did not secure the servant passages, Marcus said. He posted guards at every door and window, but he forgot that this palace is older than his ambitions, older than his understanding, and I have spent 3 years learning its secrets. He offered her the vial. The antidote must reach your father within the hour. I can guide you through the hidden corridors to his chambers. But after that, I must deal with your brother. Valeth took the vial with trembling hands. You planned all of this from the very beginning? I planned for the possibility, Marcus corrected gently. But the choice is still yours. Valeth, I have done what I can to give you options. But you must decide what to do with them. She looked at the man she had dismissed as harmless for 3 years, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Why? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why help me? You could have let this chaos destroy us and escaped to free your people. Marcus was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because you never treated me as less than a person, he said finally. You were cold and distant and sometimes thoughtless, but you were never cruel in 3 years. You never once called me a pet. Valeth felt tears burning in her eyes. That is such a small thing. No, Marcus replied. And his voice was soft but certain. It is not. The servant passages of the palace smelled of dust and forgotten centuries as Marcus led Valeth through the darkness with nothing but memory to guide his steps. Had walked these corridors 100 times in the past 3 years. Always alone, always in silence, memorizing every turn and every hidden door until the path was burned into his mind like a scar. How much further? Valeth whispered behind him, her breath warm against his shoulder in the narrow space. 3 more turns, then a ladder. Then we emerge behind the tapestry in the medical wing. Marcus replied without slowing. Your father's guards are loyal to him. Not your brother. Show them the antidote and explain what has happened. They will let you through. And what will you do? Marcus paused at a junction where the passage split into 3 branches. I will do what I have been preparing to do for 3 years. He turned to face her in the darkness. And even without light, she could feel the intensity of his gaze. When you reach your father, give him the antidote and stay by his side. Do not leave the medical wing under any circumstances. No matter what you hear, can you promise me that? Valeth wanted to argue, wanted to demand that she come with him. But something in his voice told her that this was not a request. I promise, she said. Marcus nodded once, then reached out and took her hand, pressing something cold and metallic into her palm. A communication device, he explained. Human technology, small enough that your brother's scanners will not detect it if something goes wrong. Press the button and help will come. What kind of help? The kind that has been waiting for my signal for the past 2 years, Marcus replied. And before she could ask another question, he was gone. Vanishing into the darkness of the left passage, like a shadow returning to its source, Valith stood alone for a long moment. Her heart's pounding and her mind racing with questions that would have to wait for answers. Then, she turned toward the right passage and began to climb. Marcus moved through the palace like a ghost. Like a memory, like the silence between heartbeats, he had shed his servant's clothing somewhere in the passages, replacing it with a dark suit of his own design that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. In his hands, he carried a blade, not a Celestin weapon of plasma and energy, but a simple knife forged from kitchen steel and sharpened to an edge that could split hairs. It was not impressive by the standards of this empire, but Marcus had learned long ago that impressive and effective were not the same thing. The first guards he encountered were posted at the junction between the servant wing and the noble quarters, too. Massive Celestin warriors who should have been loyal to the crown. They did not see him until he was already behind them, and by then it was too late. He moved on without looking back, leaving unconscious bodies and disabled weapons in his wake. The servants he passed did not raise alarms. They pressed against the walls and watched with wide eyes as the human they had known for 3 years walked past with purpose in his stride. Some of them nodded. Small movements that might have meant anything. Marcus nodded back. The next obstacle was a security checkpoint staffed by soldiers wearing Kethral's personal insignia, a golden serpent coiled around a sword, the symbol of ambition poorly disguised as strength. Marcus did not approach directly. Instead, he accessed a maintenance panel that he had rigged months ago, overloading the checkpoint's power supply and plunging the corridor into darkness. In the chaos that followed, he slipped past like smoke through a cracked window. The communication arrays were his next target, a room filled with glowing crystals and humming machinery that connected the palace to the rest of the Dominion. 2 technicians worked the night shift, their attention focused on their screens while their minds wandered through boredom. Marcus entered through a ventilation shaft that he had widened himself over the course of several months, dropping silently behind a bank of equipment that hid him from view. He had studied these systems for years, watching the technicians work, reading their manuals when they left them unattended, practicing on isolated components until he understood their function. As well as any Celestin engineer, it took him 43 seconds to disable the external communications. It took another 12 to set up a delayed feedback loop that would make the arrays appear functional for the next several hours. The technicians never knew he was there. Prince Kethral had gathered his closest allies in the throne room, celebrating his victory before it was even complete. Marcus watched from the shadows of a gallery that overlooked the grand chamber, counting faces and memorizing positions. 12 nobles sat at a long table, drinking wine and laughing at jokes about the fallen princess and her human pet. 20 guards stood at attention around the room, their weapons ready, but their minds relaxed, and at the head of the table sat Kethral himself, golden and glorious and utterly blind to the danger that had been growing in his own house for 3 long years. Marcus waited until the servants had finished pouring the latest round of drinks. Then he pressed a button on a device he had built from stolen components and salvaged technology. Every light in the Vendée, every light in the throne room went dark. Screams erupted in the blackness, followed by the crash of overturning chairs and the clatter of drawn weapons. Intruder! Kethral's voice roared above the chaos. Find the human and kill him. But Marcus was no longer in the gallery. He was among them now, moving through the darkness with the ease of someone who had spent months practicing in pitch-black conditions. Guards fell without knowing what had struck them. Pressure point here. A disrupted nerve cluster there. Techniques learned from human martial arts that the Celestin had never thought to study by the time emergency lighting flickered to life. Half the guards were unconscious, and the nobles were pressed against the walls with fear painted across their bioluminescent faces. Marcus stood in the center of the room, his knife gleaming and his brown eyes fixed on the prince who had thought him harmless. "You are a pet," Kethril snarled, drawing his plasma sword with a hiss of activated energy, "a primitive nothing." "I am a human," Marcus replied, and his voice was calm and quiet and absolutely certain. "We do not need claws or telepathy or bioluminescence. We just need time, and you gave me 3 years." Kethril attacked with the fury of a wounded predator, his blade cutting arcs of burning light through the air. He was faster than Marcus, stronger than Marcus, better armed than Marcus, but Marcus had watched him spar 1,000 times. He knew every favorite attack, every defensive habit, every arrogant flourish that sacrificed efficiency for style. The fight lasted less than 2 minutes in the end. Kethril lay on the floor with Marcus's knife pressed against his throat and disbelief flooding his golden eyes. "How?" The prince gasped. "How could a human?" "You never asked," Marcus said simply. "None of you ever asked." He looked up at the nobles who still cowered against the walls, their faces pale and their eyes wide. "The Emperor lives," he announced, his voice carrying through the silent room. "The Prince's Valith has administered an antidote, and he will recover by morning. This coup is over." No one moved, no one spoke, and somewhere in the depths of the palace, Marcus heard the distant sound of loyal guards responding to the princess's call. He allowed himself one small smile. 3 years of silence had finally paid off. The Emperor opened his eyes 3 days after the coup, his skin glowing with renewed strength and his mind clear for the first time since the poisoning had begun. Velith sat beside his bed, where she had kept vigil through every hour. And when he reached for her hand, she took it with tears streaming down her face. "My daughter," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Tell me everything." She told him about the poisoning and the council's betrayal, about her brother's ambition and the nobles who had supported him. She told him about the night she spent in darkness, following a human through passages she had never known existed, and she told him about Marcus, about the silent man who had saved her life more times than she could count, who had planned for disaster when everyone else was blind to its approach, who had dismantled a coup with nothing but patience and a kitchen knife when she finished. The Emperor was silent for a long moment. "Bring him to me," he said finally. Marcus entered the royal chambers with the same quiet dignity he had maintained since the day he arrived in chains. Wore simple clothes again, having refused the ceremonial robes that the palace staff had offered him. He bowed once before the Emperor, low but not subservient, the bow of a man who acknowledged authority without surrendering his own worth. "You saved my daughter," the Emperor said, studying Marcus with eyes that had judged 1,000 souls. "You saved my life, and you dismantled a conspiracy that I myself failed to see. I did what was necessary." Marcus replied simply, "That is not what I asked." The Emperor leaned forward. "Why, you owe us nothing. Your people were conquered, your freedom taken, your dignity stripped away. You had every reason to let us destroy ourselves." Marcus considered the question, and Velith watched emotions flicker across his face that she had never seen before. Pain, memory, something that might have been hope. "When I first arrived here," Marcus said slowly, "I expected to be treated like an animal. I expected cruelty, humiliation, perhaps even torture. I was prepared to endure it all and wait for my chance to escape." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "But your daughter treated me like a person. She was cold. Yes, and often distant, but she never called me a pet, never laughed when others mocked me, never used her power to make me feel small. She gave me a room with windows and books I could read and the freedom to walk where I wished." He looked at Velith, and she felt her heart skip at what she saw in his eyes. In 3 years, She gave me more dignity than I expected to find in a lifetime of captivity that mattered. It mattered more than she will ever know." The Emperor nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. "The Council is demanding your execution," he said bluntly. "You killed a prince of the blood. Human or not, there are those who believe that such an act cannot go unpunished." Valeth opened her mouth to protest, but her father raised a hand to silence her. "There are others," he continued, "who wish to study you to understand how a primitive species could accomplish what you accomplished. They speak of dissection and experimentation, and other words that should never be applied to a sentient being." Marcus did not flinch. "And what do you wish, Your Majesty?" The Emperor smiled, and for the first time since she was a child, Valeth saw genuine warmth in her father's eyes. "I wish to understand," he said, "not through study or interrogation, but through conversation. I wish to know what humans truly are, Marcus Cole, because I suspect that my empire has made a terrible mistake in dismissing your people as primitives." He rose from his bed, standing tall despite his recent illness, and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "My daughter married you as a political formality," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of imperial decree. "But I am declaring here and now that you are her husband in truth, not a tribute, not a pet, not a symbol, a full member of this household with all the rights and protections that entails." Gasps echoed from the servants and advisors who lined the walls. But the Emperor was not finished. "Furthermore, I am creating a new position, Ambassador to Humanity, and I am offering it to you. Marcus Cole, your people deserve a voice in this empire, and I can think of no one better suited to speak for them." Marcus was silent for a long moment, and Valeth saw something glistening in his brown eyes that might have been tears. "I accept," he said quietly, "on one condition. Name it." "The Earth colonies are no longer to be treated as conquered territory," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath. "They are to be recognized as a protectorate with the right to self-governance under Dominion supervision. No more tributes. No more chains. No more sending our children as gifts to alien courts." The Emperor considered this demand, and Valeth held her breath. "You ask for much," her father said. "Finally, I ask for justice," Marcus replied. "Is that not what an emperor is supposed to provide?" The silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. Then the Emperor laughed, a genuine sound of surprised delight that echoed through the chamber. "You are indeed an ambassador, Marcus Cole," he said, with admiration in his voice. "Very well, I will grant your condition, and we will see what kind of future humans and Celestin can build together." The months that followed saw changes ripple through the Dominion like stones thrown into still water. The nobles who had supported Kethril were stripped of their titles and exiled to the outer colonies, their wealth redistributed to those they had wronged. The Earth colonies received their new status with celebrations that lasted for weeks, and humans who had spent generations in servitude began to walk with their heads held high. And across the galaxy, stories spread about the silent human who had toppled a prince and saved an empire. Other alien civilizations heard these tales and began to look at their own human populations with new eyes, with confusion, with concern, with the dawning realization that perhaps they had underestimated this strange, fragile, persistent species on the first anniversary of the coup. Valeth found Marcus standing on the balcony of their shared chambers. Watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple, she stood beside him in comfortable silence, their shoulders almost touching. The distance between them shrunk to nothing by 12 months of partnership and growing affection. "You could have been a conqueror," she said softly. "You had the knowledge, the skills, the opportunity. You could have used the chaos to tear this empire apart from within." Marcus turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw the man she had come to know, patient, thoughtful, capable of violence but not defined by it. Humans are not conquerors by nature, he said. We are survivors. We adapt. We endure. We find ways to thrive in circumstances that would break other species, but we do not seek to dominate. He took her hand, and she led him, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers. We seek to belong, he continued, to find places where we are valued, communities that will accept us, people who see us for what we truly are. That is what we want, Valeth, not power, but connection. She smiled and squeezed his hand. Then perhaps you have found it, she said, and as the last light of sunset faded into stars, they stood together on the threshold of a new era, human and Celestin, husband and wife, partners in a future that neither of them could have imagined, somewhere in the darkness of space. Other empires watched and wondered and began to ask themselves a question that would haunt them for generations to come. How many other humans are out there, silent and patient and waiting? And what will happen when they finally decide to speak?